At 30:47 on the afternoon of December 17, 1944, Private First Class Curtis Adams stood in the deep snow of a Belgian forest near the village of Wereth, surrounded by 10 other black soldiers from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. They were cold, exhausted, out of ammunition, and completely cut off from American lines. The Battle of the Bulge had begun that morning, and the German offensive had overrun their position so quickly they'd had no chance to retreat. For the past 6 hours, they had evaded German patrols, moving through frozen woods, hoping to reach safety. Now emerging from the tree line near a small farmhouse, they saw German soldiers. Waffen SS. Curtis was 21 years old, from South Carolina. He had been in Europe for 4 months. He knew what surrender meant for American soldiers, prisoner of war camps, harsh conditions, but survival until war's end. What Curtis did not know, what none of the 11 men knew as they raised their hands in surrender, was that the rules did not apply to them. They were black, and the SS unit that captured them had decided that black American soldiers did not deserve the protections of the Geneva Convention. In 8 hours, Curtis Adams would be dead, so would all 10 men with him. But death would not come quickly. It would come after torture so brutal that when Belgian civilians found the bodies 2 months later, they could not identify the men by their faces. This is the story of the Wereth 11, and for 50 years the United States Army pretended it never happened. If you want a lesson how 11 black soldiers were captured, tortured for hours, murdered by the SS, and then forgotten by the army they died serving, hit that like button. This is the massacre America refused to investigate. Subscribe because their story deserves to be told. Back to Curtis. Curtis Adams was born on June 3, 1923 in Scottsburg, South Carolina, the youngest of 4 children. His father worked as a sharecropper, never earning enough to own land. Curtis grew up picking cotton, attending a segregated school with no books, no supplies, nothing the white schools took for granted. He left school at age 14 to work full-time. By 1943, when he turned 20, Curtis had never left South Carolina, had never earned more than a few dollars a week, had never imagined a future beyond the fields where his father had spent his entire life. Then America entered World War II, and the Army needed men, including black men. Curtis enlisted in the U.S. Army on March 12, 1943 at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. The recruiting sergeant processed him without looking up, assigned him to the Army Service Forces, and sent him to basic training. The training was segregated. Black recruits lived in separate barracks, trained separately, were told explicitly that they would not serve in combat roles. The Army believed black men were suitable for labor, digging trenches, loading supplies, driving trucks, cooking food. Artillery units were considered semi-combat, meaning black soldiers could be assigned to them, but only in support roles and always under the command of white officers. Curtis was assigned to the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion in May 1943. The battalion consisted of approximately 500 men, all black except for the officers. They trained at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, learning to operate 155 mm howitzers, massive artillery pieces that fired 95-pound shells up to 16 miles. The work was brutal, loading shells in all weather, digging gun emplacements, moving the guns by hand when vehicles were unavailable. Curtis was assigned as an ammunition handler, responsible for carrying shells from storage to the guns during fire missions. A single shell weighed nearly 100 pounds. Curtis carried dozens per mission. The 33rd shipped to Europe in October 1944, arriving in France and moving quickly to the front lines in Belgium. By December, they were positioned near the German border, supporting the 106th Infantry Division. The 106th was a new division, inexperienced, holding a quiet sector of the line, where command believed nothing significant would happen. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 am, Germany launched its largest offensive of the war, Operation Wartime, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. Over 200,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks, and hundreds of artillery pieces attacked along an 80-mile front. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The attack hit the 106th Infantry Division directly. Within hours, the division was surrounded and collapsing. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was positioned near the town of Schonenberg, Belgium, approximately 5 miles behind the front lines. They were supporting the 106th with artillery fire. But as the German offensive rolled forward, it became clear the battalion was about to be overrun. At approximately 9:00 am on December 17th, the battalion commander ordered a retreat. The howitzers were too heavy to move quickly. Most were disabled and abandoned. The men were told to evacuate on foot, moving west toward American lines. The retreat was chaotic. German armor was advancing faster than American troops could withdraw. Units were scattered, communication broke down, and soldiers moved in small groups through frozen forests, trying to avoid capture. Curtis Adams and 10 other men from Battery C became separated from the main battalion during the retreat. The 11 men were Private First Class Curtis Allen, 1, South Carolina; Corporal Major Bradley, 23, Mississippi; Private First Class George Davis Jr., 23, Alabama; Technician 5th Grade Nathaniel Moss, 29, Texas; Private James Stewart, 25, West Virginia; Private Dew Turner, 32, Arkansas; Private First Class William Pritchett, 22; Staff Sergeant Thomas Forty, 25, Mississippi; Private Robert Green, 21, Georgia; Private James Leatherwood, 22, Mississippi; Private First Class George Moten, 24, Texas. They moved west through heavy snow, staying off roads, avoiding German patrols. By mid-afternoon on December 17th, they were exhausted, cold, and disoriented. They had no food, no map, and only a few rounds of ammunition left. Near the village of Wereth, they saw a farmhouse. They approached cautiously. A Belgian civilian, Matthias Langer, came out. Langer spoke broken English. The soldiers explained they were Americans trying to reach their lines. Langer said the area was full of German troops. He offered them shelter, food, a place to rest. The soldiers entered the farmhouse. They stayed for approximately 30 minutes. Langer gave them bread and water. They warmed themselves by the fire. Curtis Adams sat near the window watching the road. Then he saw movement. German soldiers. Langer saw them too. He told the Americans to hide in the cellar. It was too late. The Germans had seen the farmhouse, had seen the Americans enter. They surrounded the building. At approximately 3:47 p.m. the Germans entered the farmhouse. They were Waffen SS, 1st SS Panzer Division, Kampfgruppe Nittel. The SS ordered the 11 American soldiers to come out. The Americans had no ammunition left to fight. They surrendered. They were lined up outside the farmhouse, hands raised. Matthias Langer watched from inside. He expected the Germans to march the Americans away as prisoners. That is not what happened. The SS commander looked at the 11 black soldiers and gave an order in German. The SS soldiers began beating them. Curtis Adams was hit in the face with a rifle butt. He fell. He was kicked repeatedly. The other 10 soldiers were beaten the same way. Matthias Langer watched from the farmhouse window, too terrified to intervene. The beating continued for several minutes. Then the SS soldiers forced the 11 Americans to march east, away from the village into the woods. Langer lost sight of them. What happened next was reconstructed from the condition of the bodies found 2 months later and from testimony of other survivors of SS atrocities who described similar treatment. The reconstruction is graphic and disturbing, but it must be told, because the United States Army chose not to tell it for 50 years. The 11 soldiers were marched approximately 300 yards into a clearing in the woods. They were ordered to stand in a line. Then the torture began. The SS soldiers used bayonets, knives, rifle butts, and their hands. Curtis Adams had his fingers cut off one by one. His legs were broken with rifle butts. His eyes were gouged out. He was bayoneted multiple times in the chest and abdomen. He was not shot. He bled to death slowly. The same treatment was applied to all 11 men. Some had their legs broken and were forced to kneel before being bayoneted. Some had their skulls crushed with rifle butts. Some were castrated. All were tortured before they were killed. The torture lasted hours. It was not combat. It was not a quick execution. It was deliberate, systematic mutilation. The SS left the bodies in the snow. They did not bury them. They did not report them as prisoners of war. They simply left them to freeze. By nightfall on December 17, 1944, all 11 men were dead. Curtis Adams, who had never been outside South Carolina until the army sent him to Europe, died in a Belgian forest, tortured to death by soldiers who believed his race made him subhuman. The bodies remained in the snow for 2 months. The Battle of the Bulge raged through late December and into January 1945. American forces eventually pushed the Germans back, but the area around Wereth was not recaptured until mid-January. Even then, no one knew the 11 soldiers were there. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion had listed them as missing in action, presumed captured. No search was conducted. On February 17, 1945, 2 months after the massacre, Belgian civilians from Wereth were walking through the woods and discovered the bodies. They were frozen solid, partially covered by snow. The civilians immediately reported the discovery to American military authorities. A graves registration team was dispatched. The team photographed the bodies, documented their condition, and attempted identification. The condition of the bodies was shocking even to experienced graves registration personnel. The extent of mutilation indicated prolonged torture. The team noted in their report, bodies show evidence of extreme violence prior to death. Multiple fractures, amputations, and facial destruction inconsistent with combat wounds. Evidence suggests torture. The bodies were removed and buried in a temporary military cemetery in Belgium. The army identified 10 of the 11 men through dog tags and personal effects. One body could not be identified due to facial destruction. Eventually, all 11 were identified. The families were notified that their sons had been killed in action. They were not told about the torture. They were not told about the massacre. The official cause of death was listed as killed in action, Battle of the Bulge. The army did not investigate. There was no inquiry into how 11 soldiers from the same unit ended up dead in the same location with clear evidence of torture. There was no effort to identify the German unit responsible. There was no war crimes investigation. The massacre of the Wereth 11 was documented, photographed, and filed away. Then it was forgotten. This was not an oversight. This was a decision. The U.S. Army had established war crimes investigation teams specifically to document atrocities committed by German forces against American soldiers. The most famous case was the Malmedy massacre, which occurred on the same day as the Wereth murders, December 17, 1944. At Malmedy, SS troops executed 84 American prisoners of war, mostly white soldiers from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Malmedy massacre was immediately investigated. Witnesses were interviewed. Evidence was collected. After the war, the perpetrators were tracked down, prosecuted, and many were executed or imprisoned. The Malmedy massacre became one of the most well-known atrocities of World War II. The Wereth 11 received none of this attention. No investigation, no prosecution, no justice. The reason was obvious and unspoken: the victims were black. The army did not consider the murder of 11 black soldiers worthy of the same effort. given to white soldiers. The families of the Wereth 11 were never told what had happened to their sons. They were given folded flags and told their boys had died heroes. They were not told their sons had been tortured for hours before being murdered. They were not told the army had chosen not to investigate. The bodies of the Wereth 11 were eventually repatriated to the United States. Some were buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Others were buried in their hometowns. Curtis Adams was buried in South Carolina. His mother, who had sent him off to war believing he would come home a hero, attended his funeral. She was told he died fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. She was never told the truth. For 50 years, the Wereth 11 remained forgotten. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was deactivated after the war. The survivors returned home and tried to rebuild their lives. Some spoke about the Battle of the Bulge, about being overrun, about retreating through the snow. None knew what had happened to Curtis Adams and the other 10 men who had gone missing. The official records listed them as killed in action. No details were provided. In Belgium, the story was different. The civilians of Wereth had not forgotten. They remembered the 11 black soldiers who had been murdered in their woods. In the 1980s, a Belgian schoolteacher named Herman Langer began researching the massacre. He interviewed elderly villagers who remembered the discovery of the bodies. He searched military archives. He found the graves' registration reports, the photographs, the evidence that had been filed away and forgotten. He was horrified by what he discovered and more horrified that no one in America seemed to know or care. Herman Langer began a campaign to memorialize the Wereth 11. He contacted American veterans organizations, civil rights groups, military historians. Most ignored him. The few who responded said they had never heard of the massacre. Langer persisted. In 1994, he organized the construction of a memorial in Wereth. The memorial was a simple stone monument with the names of the 11 soldiers and a plaque describing what had happened. The Belgian government supported the memorial. The U.S. Army did not. No American officials attended the dedication. The memorial stood in a Belgian village honoring American soldiers, and America was not there. In 2001, journalist Linda Hervieux began investigating the story after hearing about the memorial. She traveled to Belgium, interviewed Herman Langer and other witnesses, reviewed the military archives, and wrote a book titled Forgotten: The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes. Her research brought the Wereth 11 back into public awareness, but only slightly. The story received limited media coverage. Most Americans had never heard of the massacre. In 2004, the U.S. Army finally acknowledged the Wereth 11. 60 years after the massacre, the Army issued a statement recognizing the soldiers and their sacrifice. The statement did not apologize for failing to investigate. It did not explain why the massacre had been covered up. It simply acknowledged that 11 black soldiers had been killed and that their deaths deserved recognition. This acknowledgement was symbolic and insufficient, but it was something. In 2007, a memorial ceremony was held in Belgium with American officials in attendance. Family members of some of the Wereth 11 traveled to Belgium to see the memorial. They learned for the first time the full details of what had happened to their relatives. Curtis Adams' niece attended. She was 60 years old. She had never known how her uncle died. When she learned the truth, she collapsed. She had spent her entire life believing he died in combat. Learning that he had been tortured for hours before being murdered was unbearable. She demanded to know why the Army had never told her family. No one could give her an answer. In 2011, a documentary titled The Wereth 11 was released, directed by Robert Child. The film told the story of the massacre and the decades of silence that followed. It included interviews with historians, veterans, and family members. The documentary was shown at film festivals and military history conferences, but it received limited mainstream distribution. The story of the Wereth 11 remained largely unknown to the general public. The Wereth 11 were not the only black soldiers murdered by German forces during World War II. Other cases are documented, but the Wereth 11 are the only case where the torture was so extensive and the army's indifference so absolute. The massacre raises a question that cannot be avoided. Would the army have investigated if the victims had been white? The answer is yes. The Malmedy massacre proves it. On the same day, in the same region, SS troops murdered 84 white American soldiers. The army immediately launched an investigation. Evidence was collected. Witnesses were interviewed. After the war, the perpetrators were hunted down. 73 SS soldiers were tried for war crimes. 43 were sentenced to death. 11 were executed. The others had their sentences commuted but remained imprisoned for years. The Malmedy massacre was treated as a war crime, prosecuted vigorously, and remembered in every history book about World War II. The Wereth 11 received none of this. No investigation, no prosecution, no memory. The only difference between Malmedy and Wereth was race. The victims at Malmedy were white. The victims at Wereth were black. And in 1944, the United States Army did not consider black soldiers worthy of the same effort. This was not unique to the military. This was America in 1944. Black soldiers served in a segregated army, were assigned to labor roles, were denied promotions, and were treated as second class even in uniform. When they were murdered, the army did not care enough to seek justice. The message was clear: black lives, even in service to their country, did not matter. Curtis Adams was 21 years old when he died. He had enlisted believing military service would earn him respect, maybe even a better future. He was wrong. He died tortured in a Belgian forest, and his country forgot him for 50 years. His mother died in 1963, never knowing the truth. His niece learned the truth at age 60, when it was too late to demand accountability from anyone who had made the decision not to investigate. The Wereth 11 represent a truth about World War II that is rarely told. Black soldiers were not just fighting the enemy. They were fighting their own country's indifference. They served in a military that did not value them, that did not protect them, and that did not seek justice when they were murdered. This is not a peripheral story. This is not a footnote. This is the reality of black service in World War II. Belgium built a memorial to the Wereth 11. America did not. Belgian schoolchildren learn their names. American schoolchildren do not. The disconnect is obscene. 11 American soldiers were tortured and murdered, and a foreign country cares more about remembering them than the country they died serving. In 2021, the National Museum of the United States Army opened in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The museum includes an exhibit on the Battle of the Bulge. The Wereth 11 are mentioned in a single sentence. No names, no details, no photographs. Just a sentence acknowledging that some black soldiers were killed. This is progress, but it is insufficient. Curtis Adams and the 10 men who died with him deserve more than a sentence. They deserve to be remembered the way the Malmedy victims are remembered, with full documentation, with prosecutions of their killers, with national acknowledgement of the injustice. The SS soldiers who murdered the Wereth 11 were never prosecuted. Most likely, they died of old age, never facing consequences for their crimes. The army officers who decided not to investigate were never held accountable. They retired with pensions and honors. The system that allowed this injustice was never reformed. The same military that failed the Wereth 11 continued to operate for decades, segregated and indifferent, until forced to change by external pressure. The question the Wereth 11 forces us to confront is simple. What does service mean if it does not guarantee basic humanity? Curtis Adams and his 10 comrades served their country. They followed orders. They fought when asked, and when they were captured, tortured, and murdered, their country did nothing. Not because it couldn't, because it chose not to. That choice was informed by racism. There is no other explanation. If this story made you angry, if it made you question what America owes its soldiers, if it made you realize that some debts can never be repaid, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who thinks military service guarantees respect. Subscribe to this channel, because the Wereth 11 are not the only forgotten soldiers, and their stories deserve to be told. Drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you knew about the Wereth 11 before this video. Tell us you were here. Because Curtis Adams and 10 other men were tortured for hours and forgotten for decades, Belgium built them a memorial. America barely remembers their names. We will not let that continue. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. The Wereth 11 died serving a country that did not value them. Let's make sure they are finally honored.